The sentence that ended my 23-year career came from a black square on a Zoom call. No face. No eye contact. Just a voice saying, "Your position is being eliminated effective immediately." I want to tell you how one forgotten contract clause brought an entire company to its knees. But first, I need to take you back to that conference room. Because the ending only makes sense if you understand exactly what they decided I was worth. My name is Andrew Pierce. I was 52 years old, and I had built the system that kept Stravara alive. At 8:45 that morning, I walked into the same conference room where we held our weekly systems review. Same long table. Same burnt coffee smell drifting in from the break room down the hall. But this time, nobody was waiting for me. Just one sealed envelope sitting at the head of the table. My name printed on the front in neat black letters. Like this was a wedding invitation, instead of the end of everything I had given. The Zoom window showed Melissa Bradford's name, but not her face. Just a black square with white initials in the center. Like even she understood she should not look me in the eye while doing this. Beside her, another black square. HR. No general counsel. No, Thomas Bradford. Nobody who had been in the building during the nights when Ravex almost collapsed. When I slept under my desk. When one bad deployment could have cost us the Series B funding the entire company was depending on. Melissa's voice was calm, polished, almost rehearsed. "We're restructuring some of our legacy roles," she said. Legacy. I let that word sit for a moment. Melissa was 34 years old. 3 months into the company, carrying the title Chief Innovation Officer because her father owned the building and signed the checks. She had a Wharton MBA, a very expensive confidence, and no real understanding of the system she had just decided was outdated. Last month, she had asked in a product meeting if Ravex could use artificial intelligence to predict user emotions. When I explained that infrastructure security detects threats, not feelings, she typed one sentence into her laptop notes without looking up. Andrew resistant to innovation. That was the box she had already put me in before this call ever happened. What Melissa did not understand, what she never bothered to find out, was that Ravex was not just another product with a logo and a sales deck. It was the spine of the entire company. I had designed the architecture from scratch, written the core encryption protocols by hand, and rebuilt the system at 3 in the morning more times than any executive would ever admit in a board meeting. When servers failed, they called me. When investors needed proof the platform could scale to federal contracts, I was the one producing answers in the lab. When new engineers joined, I trained them before they were trusted with a single production environment. Half the people sitting above me now had learned how the system worked from my whiteboard markers, my emergency fixes, and my patience. And somehow, over the course of 3 months, I had become legacy. I could have argued. I could have asked Melissa if she even knew what Ravex stood for. I could have reminded HR that I had been patching production failures before Melissa knew the company's name. I could have demanded Thomas Bradford get off his black square and explain this to my face instead of hiding behind his daughter. But I did not say any of that. I looked at the envelope on the table. I looked at Melissa's initials on the screen. She asked if there was anything else we needed to address. HR waited in silence. "No," I said. "We're done here." I closed the laptop. The room went quiet except for the hum of the lights overhead. I picked up the envelope but did not open it. When I walked past Owen Walsh's desk near the corridor, he looked up and saw my face before I said a word. "Andrew," he asked softly. "They're restructuring legacy roles." I told him. He understood before I reached the elevator. What they did not know, what Melissa and HR and Thomas Bradford and every executive hiding behind those black Zoom squares did not know, was that Stravara had never truly owned the heart of Ravex. They owned the offices. They owned the servers. They owned the branding decks, the investor presentations, the glass conference rooms, and the polished lies they told themselves about disruption. But the core architecture, the original encryption protocols, The foundation every version of the system had been built on. That had been mine before Stravara ever put my name on an employment contract. And 10 years earlier, I had made one quiet decision to keep it that way. No announcement, no threat, no drama, just paperwork. And that paperwork was about to become the most expensive thing Stravara never bothered to read. My father had given me that idea before he died. He was a patent attorney for 40 years. The kind of man who read every contract with a pen in his hand and silence on his face. He had the habit of underlining clauses in the margins, writing small notes to himself in pencil, then going back and erasing them before he signed anything. He taught me that lawyers were not the enemy of builders. They were the builders who showed up 6 months after everything went wrong. 3 days before his heart stopped without warning, he left me a voicemail. His voice was rough and tired in the way it always got when he was being honest instead of careful. "Andrew," he said, "whatever you're building at that startup, don't give them ownership before they earn your trust. Set up an LLC. File the provisional patent yourself. You can always license it later, but keep the signature yours for now." At the time, I thought he was being cautious, maybe even a little bitter. Years earlier, a firm had erased his name from a patent he had worked on for 3 years, and he spent 6 months in court recovering what was already his. I knew that wound had never fully closed. But grief changes the way you listen. After his funeral, I sat in his home office, surrounded by law books, filing cabinets, and the particular silence of a room that had belonged to someone who was no longer there. The desk still had his notepad, his pencil, and an unfinished cup of coffee that someone had forgotten to throw away. I sat in his chair and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I did exactly what he told me to do. I filed the paperwork for Pierce Technical Solutions LLC in Delaware before Stravara ever offered me a full-time contract. Then I submitted the provisional patent for what I was calling Ravix Core System. Version 0.9 Alpha. The architecture. The encryption protocols. The structural foundation every later version of the system would depend on owner and architect Andrew Pierce. When Stravara's legal team drew up my employment contract 6 weeks later, they made the assumption that companies almost always make. They assumed everything belonged to them because I had done the work while connected to their network. Their attorney glanced at the paperwork, saw my signature, and filed it away without checking the dates or asking what existed before the employment relationship began. But I had not transferred Ravix to Stravara. I had licensed it. And buried inside that licensing agreement were 2 clauses nobody had bothered to read since the day it was signed. The first clause said Stravara could not transfer, sublicense, or create major derivative works from the Ravix architecture without written approval from the original architect. That meant me. The second clause was simpler, and in some ways more dangerous. No renaming. No rebranding. No public repositioning of the Ravix system without my written consent. For years, nobody noticed those clauses because nobody needed to. Stravara was growing. Investors were satisfied, and I kept the machine running. Everything was fine as long as nobody asked the question underneath the assumption. Then Melissa Bradford arrived with her expensive suit and her innovation strategy deck and decided the company needed transformation. 1 month before firing me, she stood on a stage at TechCrunch Disrupt and announced that Ravix would become Innovate X. New logo, new slogan, new website, full rebrand. She called it the future of intelligent infrastructure. She never asked engineering what they thought. She never asked legal to review the original licensing terms. Most importantly, she never asked me. I found out from a post on social media while sitting at my own desk, staring at the new name of the system I had built with my own hands over more than 2 decades. Melissa thought she had modernized a product. What she had actually done was breach the contract in public, in front of the entire industry. 3 days after they fired me, the email arrived. Wednesday morning, 9:23. I was sitting on my couch in sweatpants, drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring out the window at a parking lot and a row of tired trees. My laptop chimed. Subject line, request for confidential conversation. Sender Richard Quinn. Chief Technical Officer, Betrayal. I stared at the name for longer than I should have. Betrayal was not just any company. They were Strava's oldest and most serious competitor. We studied them in strategy meetings. Our sales team hated losing to them. Engineering quietly respected how they built things. His message was short and direct. He said they believed not Strava, held the underlying intellectual property rights to Ravex. And they wanted to have a conversation about what that meant. I booked a flight for Monday morning. Betrayal's headquarters did not look like Strava's glass palace. No giant logo wall in the lobby. No motivational phrases stenciled on the walls. No executives moving through the hallways performing urgency. It felt quieter, sharper, like a place where people had gotten tired of the performance and decided to just build things properly. Richard Quinn met me at the elevator. He was 58, tall, gray at the temples, with the tired eyes of someone who had spent decades inside real systems instead of pitching them. He shook my hand once. Andrew, thank you for coming. You said you did your homework. I said, show me. He led me into a conference room and set a folder on the table. Inside were copies of my LLC filing, the Ravex provisional patent, the employment contract timeline, and the original licensing agreement. Clauses 8.2 and 11.3 were highlighted in yellow on the relevant page. Richard tapped the sheet once. "You're the owner of the core architecture," he said, "not Strava." For the first time since that Zoom call, someone was saying the truth out loud. Then he slid a second document across the table. It was not sympathy. It was not a thank you. It was a contract. Exclusive licensing rights to the Ravex core architecture for 10 years. Total value $740 million. Not a single payment overnight, but a decade-long licensing arrangement tied to federal deployments. Integration milestones. And exclusive technical rights. My role would be Chief Technical Architect, with full approval over every derivative system built on my work. My name would be attached to the architecture publicly, listed on every press release, every technical specification, every government filing. I read every page twice because my father had taught me never to trust a number until I trusted the language surrounding it. Richard waited without filling the silence. "We don't hire pedigrees," he said finally. "We hire architects." I held the contract and thought about a lot of things at once. 23 years is a heavy thing to close with one signature. I thought about every night I stayed late while executives took their families to dinner. Every weekend I answered emergency calls from engineers who needed someone who actually knew the system. Every young engineer I trained on a whiteboard. Every offer from other companies I had turned down because I believed loyalty meant something if you held it long enough. Then I remembered Melissa's black square. No face, no apology, no recognition. They had not fired me because I failed. They fired me because someone who had never built anything decided that branding was the same as value, and that a man who had been keeping the lights on for 23 years was a legacy problem instead of a foundation. I looked at the final page. My name was already printed beneath the signature line. Andrew Pierce, Chief Technical Architect. For the first time in years, the title matched the work. I picked up the pen. One signature. Clean. Quiet. Final. I did not celebrate. I did not smile for long. I just handed the contract back to Richard and looked at the table. And with that, Strava's most expensive mistake became Betrayal's future. By Wednesday of the following week, the first cracks appeared. Owen texted me before I had finished my breakfast. "Dude, Strava's homepage changed. The Innovate X banner is completely gone." I read the message and took a slow sip of coffee. A minute later, he sent another one. Legal had issued an urgent internal memo demanding a full audit of every Ravex licensing agreement. Effective immediately. No explanation. No calm corporate language. Just panic dressed up as procedure. I could picture the scene perfectly. Lawyers pulling old folders from filing cabinets they had not touched in years. Executives asking questions they should have asked a decade ago. Melissa Bradford staring at a screen, realizing for the first time that a rebrand was not just a marketing decision, and that nobody on her team had checked whether she was allowed to rename the thing. I typed back one sentence. Maybe they're finally reading the contracts. Then I set my phone down. Friday morning. Verilia's press release went live. Verilia Tech partners with Andrew Pierce, creator of RavX Core Architecture. Not former Stravara engineer. Not legacy employee. Not eliminated position. Creator. By 10 in the morning, the announcement had hit every major technology publication. By noon, industry newsletters were picking it up. By 2 in the afternoon, LinkedIn was moving fast. People I had not heard from in 5 years were messaging me with versions of the same question. Did Stravara really not own RavX? Were you the actual rights holder this whole time? Is InnovateX even a legitimate product launch? I answered almost none of them. I did not need to explain anything. The documents were doing that better than I ever could. Every investor, client, and competitor who had accepted Stravara's story about the future was now looking at the same uncomfortable truth. The company's flagship product had been built on a foundation they had never actually owned, and the man they fired over Zoom was the only name legally attached to it. The next morning, Owen sent me an audio file with no message attached. Just the file name exec meeting recording. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed play. First came the scrape of chairs, then a few seconds of background noise, then Melissa's voice. And she did not sound polished anymore. Wait, she said. He used a different entity name, Pierce Technical Solutions. Thomas Bradford answered. Tight and flat. The filing predates his full-time employment contract by 6 weeks. Silence filled the recording. Then someone asked the question Stravara should have asked 10 years earlier. So we don't own RavX. Nobody corrected him. Nobody said he was wrong. Nobody reassured the room. And in that silence, I heard the exact moment their confidence turned into something else entirely. The meeting recording kept going. Melissa's voice came back smaller now, stripped of the rehearsed confidence I had listened to across so many meetings. This is fixable. Right, we call him. We negotiate. Offer equity. Whatever he needs. He already negotiated. Thomas said flatly. With Verilia. Another silence. This one heavier. Then a board member cut through it with the kind of voice that had run out of patience entirely. He went to our main competitor because you fired him. Without consulting legal. Without checking intellectual property ownership. Without doing basic due diligence. Melissa tried to offer something. I had HR on the call. HR is not legal counsel. There was a pause. And then someone asked where general counsel had been during my termination. Another voice muttered something about a camera staying off. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. They had not made one mistake. They had built an entire executive decision on arrogance, assumption, and the kind of nepotism that assumes competence is inherited. And now every piece of it had Melissa's name on it. Subscribe if you believe that quiet people are the most dangerous ones when they have finally been pushed far enough. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone tried to erase 23 years of your work with a 3-minute Zoom call? By Monday morning, Stravara's problems were no longer internal. The first lawsuit arrived at 9 in the morning. A group of Series C investors filed a complaint claiming the company had misrepresented its ownership of core intellectual property during the financing rounds. 2 hours later, the Series D lead filed a second complaint, this one with colder language and larger numbers attached. By 2 in the afternoon, a federal contractor joined them. They had signed a $47 million RavX deployment agreement 3 months earlier, believing Stravara held full ownership of the system it was selling. Their attorneys argued the contract could not stand if Stravara could not guarantee clean intellectual property. They wanted out. And they wanted their costs covered. I watched the headlines land one by one on my screen. I did not need to say anything. I did not need to make calls or send emails or brief a single journalist. The contracts were speaking for themselves. and the story they told was worse than anything I could have written. Then the market reacted. Strivara's stock started falling the moment trading opened. At first, the company tried to call it volatility, a temporary overcorrection, investor confusion, the kind of language that buys you about 48 hours before the numbers stop caring about spin. By noon, the stock was down nearly 20%. By the closing bell, Strivara had shed 28% of its market value in a single trading day. The next morning brought another drop at the open, then another wave of sell orders before lunch. Within 4 trading days, nearly half the company's total value had disappeared. $810 million became $430 million. I sat with that number for a while. Not because I wanted to celebrate it. Somewhere inside that collapsing company were engineers like Owen, people who had built real things, solved real problems, and believed the same thing I once believed, that if you were good enough and loyal enough and patient enough, the company would protect you when it finally mattered. It hadn't protected me. And now, it wasn't protecting them either. I hadn't leaked a single line of code. I hadn't called a single journalist. I hadn't sent one threatening email. All I had done was sign a contract with a company that had bothered to read mine first. A venture partner I knew texted me that afternoon with a short message. Just pulled our Series D commitment. $67 million. Should have read the contracts years ago. I typed back. Due diligence is everyone's job. By Wednesday evening, Melissa posted on LinkedIn, grateful for the opportunity to serve as strategic advisor going forward. Excited to support Strivara's next chapter in a different capacity. Strategic advisor. I read it twice. That was corporate language for something very specific. It meant we cannot publicly fire the CEO's daughter, but she will never touch another real decision again. The comments moved fast before she shut them off. How do you rebrand a product you never owned the rights to? This is what happens when nepotism meets no technical due diligence. Advisor to what exactly? The lawsuits you created. I did not like the post. I did not comment. I did not share it. I just closed the browser. Melissa had wanted a transformation story. She had wanted her name attached to the future of the company her father built. Now her name was attached to something else entirely. Thursday morning, Strivara announced that Thomas Bradford was stepping down as CEO effective immediately. The press release used the standard polished language. He wanted to spend more time with his family. He was proud of what the company had built over the decades. He was excited to support the next generation of leadership from a different role. I had been around enough executives to know exactly what that language meant. They had pushed him out. An hour later, Owen forwarded me the leaked board minutes with no comment. The real wording was considerably colder. Board vote of no confidence, 8-2. Resignation demanded due to loss of institutional investor confidence and failure to maintain adequate intellectual property oversight. I read that sentence twice. Thomas Bradford had built Strivara over 28 years. He had raised the capital, hired the first teams, stood on stages, and convinced investors and government clients that his company was transforming infrastructure security. But in the end, he had let his daughter play executive with a system she had not taken the time to understand, and then let her fire the one engineer who had actually kept it running. 4 days. That was all it took to erase a CEO who forgot that loyalty without respect eventually finds another employer. Friday afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown number. Mr. Pierce, this is Jennifer Moss, Interim General Counsel at Strivara. Do you have a moment? I looked out my apartment window. Same parking lot. Same row of tired trees I had been looking at all week. I'm listening, I said. She wanted to discuss a potential settlement, continued use of the RAVEX architecture, a revised licensing arrangement, equity, back pay, and public acknowledgement. Everything they should have offered before the Zoom call. Before the black square, before the envelope on the table. Send it in writing, I said. My attorney will review it. She started to ask a follow-up question. I thanked her and ended the call. 2 hours later, the proposal arrived by email. I read the subject line. Then I deleted it without opening the attachment. Some doors close cleanly. That one was already closed. Saturday morning, I flew back to Betrayal. Not for another negotiation. Not to gloat. For work. My first official day as chief technical architect started on the third floor, inside a lab that smelled like warm servers, dry erase markers, and coffee that had been sitting in the pot too long. It reminded me of what Stravara had felt like before the slogan started, before the glass walls went up, before executives began confusing a marketing narrative with actual engineering progress. Richard met me at the elevator. Ready to build something that lasts, he asked. Show me the lab, I said. 6 engineers were gathered near a workstation. They were quiet at first in the way that good engineers are quiet when they are measuring someone. Then one younger engineer stood up, maybe 26 or 27 years old, badge slightly crooked on his jacket, clearly fighting the urge to say something. Mr. Pierce, he said, I've read your original RAVEX filing maybe 30 times. The encryption structure in version 0.9 alpha is still one of the cleanest designs I've seen. I looked at him for a moment. Not flattery, not performance, just a person who had actually read the work. I walked to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and started where every real system starts, with the foundation. Within a month, Betrayal had begun winning the contracts Stravara used to reference in investor meetings as proof of market dominance. Defense infrastructure contracts, critical systems monitoring, federal threat detection networks. 3 major deals, all connected to RAVEX integration, all awarded to Betrayal for one reason that nobody tried to complicate. Clean ownership, the actual architect on staff, original filings with unambiguous dates. No questions about where the intellectual property had come from or who had the right to build on top of it. Stravara could no longer compete honestly because every proposal raised the same question. Do you actually own what you're selling? They didn't. And federal buyers do not gamble on uncertain intellectual property. I did not need to call their clients. I did not need to leak anything. I did not need to say a single negative word publicly. I just kept building. That was the part Melissa had never understood. Real leverage was not destruction. It was building something so clearly, so completely, and so credibly that the alternative stopped being credible at all. Over the following weeks, pieces of what was happening at Stravara reached me through old colleagues and occasional messages from Owen. New CEO. Some consultant brought in from a management firm. No technical background. Nobody trusts him yet. Then, investor lawsuits settling quietly. Undisclosed amounts. Then, on a Tuesday morning, engineering layoffs announced. 40% of the team. I sat with that one longer than the others. Not because I felt any satisfaction. Because I knew some of those engineers. Good people. People who had stayed late, solved hard problems, and believed the same quiet lie I had believed for 23 years. That if you poured enough of yourself into a company, it would find a way to honor that investment. It wouldn't. It hadn't for me. And now it wasn't for them either. Melissa had stopped coming into the office. Someone told Owen she was doing a speaking tour about leadership lessons, which was so strange that I almost thought it was a joke. The company's federal ambitions were gone. Stravara was no longer building a dominant future. It was maintaining what remained. Surviving on legacy contracts while trying to figure out what it was, now that it could no longer claim to own the product its identity had been built around. In November, I was invited to speak at the National Infrastructure Technology Summit in Dallas. 3,000 people. Defense contractors, security firms, investors, serious engineers. The kind of room Stravara executives used to pursue with polished slides and confident promises about the future. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been something I sought out. I preferred whiteboards, server logs, and problems that could be solved without a microphone. But Richard said something simple that stayed with me. They don't need the gossip, he said. They need to hear how real systems are built. So I went. When I walked onto the main stage and found my seat at the panel table, I saw the nameplate in front of me. Andrew Pierce, creator, Ravex core system, not former employee, not eliminated position, not legacy role, creator. I stood there for a moment before sitting down, just long enough to let it settle. After the panel, when most of the crowd had filtered out toward the next session, a young engineer waited near the edge of the stage. He looked about 28. Badge clipped slightly off-center on his jacket. Phone already open like he was afraid to miss something. Mr. Pierce, he said carefully. Can I ask how you knew to protect yourself 10 years ago? I thought about the voicemail. My father's tired voice. The home office with the law books and the old notepad and the unfinished cup of coffee. I didn't protect myself. I told him, I protected the work. He frowned slightly, not understanding the difference. Your employer can change your title. I said, they can take your office. They can revoke your badge before you reach the parking garage. They can call you a legacy role after using your expertise for 23 years. But if your name is on the right document, and the dates are clean, they cannot erase what you built. He typed every word into his phone without looking up. Then he asked, so you always knew they might do this? No. I said, I hoped loyalty mattered. My father just taught me to hope carefully. He nodded slowly, and I could tell he was filing that away somewhere he wouldn't forget it. That night, as I was walking out of the convention center, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject, final settlement proposal. Confidential. Sender Estravada Legal. I stopped near the glass doors and looked at it for a moment. Outside, Dallas traffic moved under orange streetlights. Inside, behind me, the last conversations of the day were winding down. 6 months earlier, that subject line might have made my hands feel cold. Now it just felt like what it was. Too late. Too polished. Too small for what they had taken from me and too large for what they were willing to admit. I deleted the email without opening it, put the phone in my pocket, and kept walking. 6 months after that, Virilia announced the contract that changed everything. $890 million. The largest infrastructure security deployment in Department of Defense history. Ravix at the center of it. Not innovate X, 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 N, X, X. Not a rebranded fantasy that had been announced on a stage without a single engineering approval. The original system, with the original architecture, built and certified by the original architect. The press release listed me as Chief Technical Architect and creator of the Ravex core system. My name appeared beside every technical specification, every architectural milestone, every government filing. For the first time in my professional life, the public record matched the truth. I read the announcement at my desk in the lab, not in a glass conference room with a polished table and a burnt coffee smell, surrounded by engineers who were arguing about latency thresholds and security layers and whether a specific protocol needed to be rebuilt from scratch. That was right. That was honest. Owen texted me that afternoon. Saw the announcement. That's incredible. Congrats. I looked at the message and thought about the envelope, the black square, the conference room. Then I typed back, thanks. How are things there? His reply came in about a minute. Quiet. Stravar is just smaller now. I read that twice. Smaller now. Quieter. Surviving on maintenance agreements instead of building anything new. The company that had demanded our nights and weekends and years and named our loyalty its own had become exactly what it had always feared. Irrelevant. I typed back. Are you looking around? A few seconds passed. Yeah. Owen wrote, quietly. Send me your resume. 10 minutes later, it arrived in my inbox. I forwarded it to Richard with one sentence. Best systems engineer I ever trained. Loyal. Smart. And knows when to hit record at the right moment. Richard replied almost immediately. Bring him in. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Not every good person escapes at the same time. But when the door opens, you hold it for the ones who deserved better. That evening, I went home, opened a beer, and sat on my couch with my father's old voicemail on the screen in front of me. I hadn't listened to it in months. For a while, I just looked at his name. It had been 10 years since I sat in his home office, hollow with grief, surrounded by law books and the particular silence of a room whose owner was no longer coming back. Back then, I thought I was just honoring his final piece of advice. I had no idea I was also protecting the one thing a company could never legally take from me. I pressed play. His voice came through the phone, rough and tired and completely honest. Corporate loyalty goes one direction until it doesn't. He said, "Trust me on this." Song. I closed my eyes. For 23 years, I believed that loyalty meant staying late, solving crises, training people, and protecting a company even when it forgot to protect you. I believed that if you gave enough of yourself, it would mean something on the day it mattered. But loyalty without respect is just a cage with better lighting. Stravara fired the employee. They cut the badge, removed the title, and left an envelope on a polished table in a conference room that still smelled like burnt coffee. But they never owned the architect. They never owned the foundation. And by the time they understood that, the foundation had already moved. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Alex's Revenge and tell me in the comments, would you have stayed quiet and prepared? Or would you have confronted them the moment you saw it coming? And if you believe the quietest people can deliver the most permanent justice, leave a comment below. I read every one of them.